Good evening. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Seema Sueko. I serve as the Deputy Artistic Director here at Arena Stage. I'm curious, how many of you have been to one of our civil dialogues before? Raise your hand. Aha, so many of you, and then a few first-timers. So just to give you a little bit of contextualization as to why we do this, at Arena Stage, with all of our productions, we strive very hard to create dialogue and stimulate thought by presenting a diversity of perspectives through the shows that you see on our stages. And a few years ago, this wonderful individual to my left, Dr. Amitai Etzioni, approached us about creating dialogue outside of our productions. So we started doing these, and it's been a wonderful journey, many spirited conversations, many new faces who have joined us to be able to be in conversation with one another and hopefully hear some things you may be familiar with and also hear some things that might challenge you, but through that, find a way to talk with one another. So, to whet your dialogue maker, those who have been here before, you know I love to do this. I ask you to turn to someone you did not come here with, so someone you do not know, and share why you're here today. What drew you to this topic? You only have 30 seconds to share your thoughts, and then hear the other person what their thoughts are. So find somebody you didn't come with. Great. Have you all had a chance to speak? Have you all had a chance to speak and also a chance to hear from somebody else? Great. I love the sound of multiple voices in this space, so thank you so much for indulging me with that. A reminder to please silence or turn off your cell phone or any other noisemaker that you might have on you. And I will now turn it over to the great Dr. Etzioni. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Seema. It's wonderful to work with you, Seema. You give some special vibes, I think, which make everybody feel very much at home. And I really appreciate your coming. I'm going, in the past, when we had these meetings, I usually try to set up two bookends in between which I was hoping the conversation will range. So, for instance, last time we discussed what the role of government should be, and I talked about one end, there are people who believe the government should be as small as possible, and the other people who believe that the time of government has come to reintroduce itself as a much bigger player, and that kind of, I tried to frame the conversation, and the conversation ranged between these two bookends. And I'm going to do something different tonight, and already asked the panel indulgent, and they agreed to let me get away with it. And that what I will do is I'll draw a picture and then ask them to tell us if they can live with it or what other picture we should draw on. So in drawing that picture, I'm drawing on a psychologist you're all familiar with by the name of Abraham Maslow. Maslow had a theory of human rights, and his idea was that human rights are organized in a pyramid. At the bottom are basic human creatures, the kind of things we all need, food and shelter and clothing and such. And on the next level was affection and esteem. And at the pyramid was self-actualization. But the important point was that in order to live a full and rich and contented life, you should not be stuck on the lowest level, on focus on creature comforts, on your basic needs, that once those are satisfied, and it's very important for what's going to follow, once those are satisfied, you should move your attention and so on to the next level, where you gain affection and prestige by spending time not by buying things, but in relationships and activities which are meaningful. So to put in a different language, consumption is fine, consumerism is wrong. Is once you start trying to buy affect by promising her diamonds. Diamonds are best friends? No, diamonds don't make good friends. Friends make good friends. That is a Maslow idea. Now, I found, and it's actually turns out to be tricky, what is included in creatures' comforts. Because people have very, very different lists. And that was driven home to me in a slightly lighter way when I gave a TED talk. There's something called TED Global. They meet in Oxford and UK and so on and so on. And so I asked the people assembled there, do you need an inflatable Santa Claus on your rooftop? And they all said, absurd. And I asked them, do you need a plastic pelican on your front lawn? And they chuckled. And then I said, do you need a flat TV? And the chuckling died down. There were one or two chuckles left in the room. And then I said, do you need an S5 phone? I think that was the most recent model at the time. And there was a certain amount of hostility in the room. I was kind of in the point of that story. By the way, you can see it. It's the tape is on YouTube. It's called "You Don't Need to Buy This," and so the point of the story is it's not so easy to tell what is truly a true human need and what some people call wants, something you want but you don't really need. Put it differently, put it in a historical context for a moment, and I'll be very short because I want to hear the panel. Before World War II, an MIT economist got a Nobel Prize for a theory which suggested that people have fixed needs, and once they're sated, they're not going to spend more, they're going to save for their retirement. And in fact, he got a Nobel Prize for that. And then came World War II, and something odd happened. While other countries were destroyed, the United States set up enormous production lines for producing thousands of tanks and airplanes and such. And then suddenly, in 1945, the war ended, and the economists were scared terribly what's going to happen to this economy, which had all these assembly lines, and what are they going to produce now because people's needs were sated. And that's where we got the mass consumption society, because we start inventing needs together with the products. So the Vance Packard wrote the critical book of that era, The Great Persuaders, in which he pointed out that the role advertising played in keeping this thing going, keep telling us that things we yesterday didn't even know about, now we need them. And if you want a recent example, I'm read studies showing that a significant proportion of young women believe that they have to remove every hair and every private part they have through wax and pain. Nobody knew that 10 years ago that you had that need. Now many people saying you cannot go without it. That's just one recent example of a need which is implanted. It didn't exist years ago. Or in the olden days, men used to wear gray flannel suits. That was it. And white shirts. They didn't realize they had each year to get the different lapel or so on and so on. So in short, we see historically a production of needs, and the question is, are they really producing to our creature comforts, or they're preventing us from moving up in the Maslow scale? There are two last subpoints. One is the reason I keep emphasizing we should not ignore that there are basic needs, because the danger that theory will be used against the poor. And the poor will be told, why don't you enjoy affection and meaningful activities and don't worry about increasing your income? No, poor people who don't have their basic needs met, they need consumption, they need income. It's a question of those who are more privileged, who have their basic needs satisfied if it's not time for them to move on. And finally, I'm about to quote social science data, and I always have to stop here and apologize because social science data is going in 15 different directions at the same time. But in this case, about 19 out of 20 studies show that after a certain level, higher income does not add to your happiness and contentment. So for instance, in Japan, after the income per capita increased 400 times, the number of people who were satisfied increased by 10%. And of course, now come the environmentalists, and they're telling us we better dial it back anyhow. So, here's the picture I'm drawing. Is it time for those who have their basic needs satisfied to buy out of this story advertising tells us, buy only things they, quote, really need, if they can tell the difference, and shift their energy and resources to spend time with their children, with their friends, with their family, and communal activities, reduce the footprint on the environment, and make us all live happy ever after. All right, if they didn't provoke a discussion, I'll talk about Trump, I guess. No. We have a tradition of not introducing the speakers because you have details in the program, and so I have now the opportunity to listen. Please.
Great. Is this working? Excellent. Well, I'll be very brief. I don't know that I need to say anything at all other than yes. But first, I want to thank you, Amitai, for having me here, and really more than that, for taking on this topic, which I suspect all of the civil dialogues that you organize have a lot to do and relate strongly to your own long work on communitarianism and how to balance the rights of the individual and the freedom of the individual with the community responsibilities in the making of a good society. And I think this particular topic, consumption, is about as rich a one as you could find, and getting richer all the time in the context of the work that you've been doing for so many decades. With perhaps the proviso that there is a focus, and I'm going to take this on a bit, as much to some degree on the natural world and natural communities, by which I mean non-human but sentient beings that aren't humans, aren't people, as much as the human one. And so I'm delighted to be taking this on. From a global perspective, I think it's pretty clear that we need to, as a society, to be moving as rapidly as we can toward sustainability as the basic ethic we need to be thinking about, and away from the concept that we have to be constantly growing the national or global economy, at least in ways that require ever more consumption of energy, particularly fossil fuel energy, other natural resources, using the air, the atmosphere, the land, the oceans to dispose of our wastes, and finding really other ways to be. And I think in this sense, when I talk about sustainability, it's not just a constraint on consumption, although I think it is going to require that, but it's actually a value. And it's a value that says that we here living in the present, particularly we who are privileged, as you referred to, those of us who are really wealthy in the context of the rest of the world, do not value our comfort, our availability of abundant pleasures and comforts and resources more than we value those that will be available to future generations. And we need to be thinking about that in ways that I don't think our ancestors really ever remotely thought about or needed to think about. And then with space for the rest of the world's creatures, the non-human, non-sentient or sentient beings, to have room for themselves as well. And that's a whole new way of thinking. I also think that unlike the way many economists think these days, we need to not have so much confidence in future generations that we think that they're going to be prosperous no matter how much we mess up the world. because that does seem to be a dominant economic view about things like climate change and the discounting of the future, the idea that no matter what we do, there's so much technological process in the works and there's so much capability for technological innovation and economic growth that no matter what we do, future generations are going to be just fine. And it's a kind of excuse that we don't really need to worry about what we do. I don't buy that idea at all. And I think the United States has a particular role in this because we were and are the pioneering consumers of the world. I think really after World War II, we really did pioneer not just a way of consuming, but really we were, and we'll talk more about this, I think our panelist Mario will particularly have something to say about this. We became pioneer marketers and advertisers, and the rest of the world mimicked our behavior and wanted to be sure they did not miss out on what we were promoting, and that's still true. And we now have a global consumer class that is growing quite rapidly, and this has very, very big impacts on the world and forces us to wrestle with what Amitai talked about, which is that we don't have any right to deny to people in the rest of the world what we enjoy ourselves. So there are now 7.7 billion people in the world, and if they all consume like Americans, we've got a real problem with the resources we have in the world, the atmosphere, the oceans, the land, and yet we can't put ourselves in a position where we are telling other people, you can't have this. So it gives us a real dilemma. So there is a real policy issue here, a set of policy issues and governmental issues that really need to be dealt with because sustainability is going to require that consumption is constrained, and the question becomes how. How are we going to do this in a fair and just way? But it isn't just a big global issue. It's actually an intensively personal issue. And I want to think about that too, because that fits the framework that Amitai presented to us with. There was a really interesting article just a week or so ago in the Washington Post, which I'm sure everyone here reads religiously. A study out of the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, that found people actually sat at crosswalks and looked at vehicles and crosswalks and pedestrians and crosswalks, and what they discovered was that the people who drove the most expensive cars were the least likely to stop for pedestrians and crosswalks. And they actually measured this in such a way that they found that for every $1,000 you added to a vehicle cost, and excuse me, those of you who are driving expensive cars to the event today, for every $1,000 of extra vehicle cost, there was a 3% lower likelihood that the driver would stop for somebody in a crosswalk. I found that very interesting because it's actually in line with a lot of psychological research that's been done that suggests that the consumption, particularly at very high levels or of luxury items, and this relates to what Amitai was just talking about, actually does change us as people. It changes the way we think about ourselves, and in particular, it changes the way we think about the rest of the world and the community that we live in and other people. So these researchers found that basically, in their words, that people who drove expensive cars tend to find themselves feeling superior to people in either less expensive cars or people who are just walking on the street. And that actually molds their thinking as they drive. There's been psychological research over the last 20 or 30 years that suggests that consumption is a matter of the balance between extrinsic and intrinsic values. I'm sure this is something that many of you here are familiar with. Extrinsic values are the kind of things that Amitai was talking about when you get to the point where you're really looking for how does society value you? What do they think of you? So do you have money? Do you have status? Are you attractive to the people that you want to be attractive to? And you're thinking about how to justify your own existence based on what others are thinking about you. Intrinsic values are more about self-development, personal growth, spending time doing things that personally satisfy you regardless of what other people think about them. And then also thinking about the values among the people you're closest to that you care the most about. So you're spending more time with the people you really care about and you're less concerned about what the world thinks of you. And there's really good evidence that consumption at, again, high-level consumption, I'm not talking about basic needs consumption, but high-level consumption actually turns people narcissistic and self-absorbed in their, it actually has this effect on you when you have a lifetime of high consumption, which is something I would venture to say that is visible at the top of the federal government right now. And the suggestion is that if we could learn perhaps to be more time affluent and less thing affluent, we might actually turn to areas that, or turn to values that would help us grow individually, help us perhaps be better citizens, certainly help us to be better in our families and our communities. And I think there are ways to get at this too. If time allows, and I'm going to pass the microphone on now, but I'm going to try to toss out some things that can be done both at the global or the national or the governmental level to constrain consumption in ways that actually do improve the well-being of society, the goodness, perhaps the happiness of society and of individuals and our own sanity. Because I think that really there probably was a time in the past when consumption did make us more secure, did make us feel safer and better about ourselves. But I think in today's world, as crazy as it is today, actually not consuming may, or consuming at a lower level may make us feel more secure, less vulnerable, more sane, and more protected somehow from the craziness that we see in the world around us. And I hope to be able to talk about that as well. So, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you both to Amitai and to Arena Stage for having me here today. I think that we all realize this is not a trivial question. I teach a class on consumer culture. I get a lot of students who think it's going to be a whole lot of fun and they can maybe figure out how to consume better or what the celebrities are doing. And then I do the gloom and doom and they start to realize maybe how serious it is. It's serious because, as has already been mentioned, we have extremely grave environmental limits that we have already surpassed. It's also serious because I think one of the things we are seeing now with the coronavirus crisis is something that was probably already underway but is going to speed up, which is the way in which manufacturing will perhaps leave China to some degree, go elsewhere in the world, as it often has, in search of a better environment for the workplace, with quite extreme results on a workforce that all of a sudden finds itself without jobs after having been producing consumer goods for much of the world. This is also a problem in that political instability around the world is often tied to the ways in which societies cannot provide the consumer goods that their citizens expect. So some of the major challenges confronting the world today are really tied to this question of consumption. Can we consume less? What happens when we do? What are the consequences of that? I also want to echo something that Amitai and Robert has said, which is that we can't just dance around the issue of those who do not have basic needs. We are talking about many people both around the world and in the United States. When we look at something like housing, which I think most of us would consider a basic need, we find that we're actually going in the wrong direction now. That is to say, it's becoming more difficult in many cities around the world to actually get shelter as the cost of housing rises. At the same time, we also have a consuming class, which is consuming ever more. And I want to come back to what seems to be a divide here between those who don't have enough and those who seem to have perhaps excess, and maybe come back to how they're actually related. But first, I want to address maybe a little bit more directly the question that Amitai raises using Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And part of the problem, I think, with that idea of a hierarchy of needs is a way in which it privileges at the very top this idea of self-realization, or is perhaps the question that was initially posed in the program put it, about happiness. And I think part of that problem, well, it's sort of twofold, which is to say that the idea of self-realization assumes that somehow or other it comes from us as individuals. That somehow or other, if we could only get in touch with our basic sense of who we are going to know what it is we want once we have those basic needs satisfied, and that will lead us to the path of self-realization. As a sociologist, I don't think that actually does emerge from us as individuals. I think that we are surrounded by many influences that tell us what it is we want. These are not homogeneous. There are a lot of conflicting influences, which is why we don't all come up with the same idea of what we want. But we do see a lot of patterns. And I think that this is, in the contemporary era, tied to this notion of happiness. Many years ago, I saw an interview with Isabel Allende, the author, who was saying, you know, I don't really get Americans. Why are they so obsessed with happiness? And she was saying that for her, what was really more important was the idea of a meaningful life. And we could say this is a matter of semantics, but I actually think that there's an important difference here. The idea of happiness is in some ways, it's about the absence of things that make us unhappy. It's the absence of disease. It's the absence of failure. It's the absence of boredom. Now, these are conditions of everyday life, and I think all of us agree that we don't want to have those kinds of conditions dominating us. But the idea that somehow we can escape them altogether, or even most of the time, sets us up for unhappiness, as it were. And I think it also leads us to finding solutions in consumption. You can buy enough health care to somehow or other stave off disease. You can buy the vacations and the entertainments to stave off boredom and other kinds of consumer goods that are going to somehow or other make your career. I think one of the other obstacles to figuring out how we can consume less as a society is related to something that Robert just brought up, which is that all of us have to grapple with the idea of what am I worth? And in a society which is, of course, so big that we don't know our neighbors, we can't really ask people to judge us as individuals who know us from birth and our families and everything about us. They look to particular cues that might seem surface, but nonetheless, we've gotten used to judging people and having them judge us on our income and our consumer goods. And our ideas about what am I worth as an employee? Well, it depends on how much I'm paid. What am I worth as a potential mate? Well, it depends on how well I can dress and look attractive and go out to the right places to meet people. And what am I worth as a person? Well, yeah, we have different ways of measuring that, but a lot of it does come back to that kind of consumption and the idea that I know how to spend my money and get the goods and experiences that make me an interesting person. So just to come back to that issue of those who don't have basic needs, I think one of the real problems we're facing is that to ask people to do with less means that you're often asking them to endanger that kind of sense of self-worth and the sense of how other people are going to judge them. Which is to say that in a society with massive inequality, or even not massive inequality, but a fair amount of inequality, I actually think it's going to be very difficult to convince people to consume less, because they're always looking around and they are seeing those who can and do consume more. So I don't see this as just about individuals being able to reach into their inner resources and come up with the will to do what they understand may be necessary, which is to do more with less. But we do, both in terms of policy and other kinds of cultural measures, have to come up with ways to both lessen inequality and come up with alternatives for how to lead a worthwhile life, and very importantly, how to judge others as people who are worthy, even if they do not consume as much as they might.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for the wise words before me. Does consumption make us happy? I'm in marketing. I'm supposed to say yes, I guess. Let me tell you a story. As you may hear by my accent, I'm not a US citizen. I'm Belgian. I came to this country in 2015, summer of 2015. One of the first things we did in this country was buy a car. We need a car. Actually, after buying a car, we quickly realized we needed a second car. And so I'm going online, and I'm looking into a cheap car, a used car, $3,000, $4,000, because I'm going to drive it around in Blacksburg. What else do I need? Just a cheap car is fine. And I don't know when or how exactly. I must have broadened my search parameters at some point, but all of a sudden, this very nice-looking sports car shows up. Now, it's expensive. Yes, it's one of those expensive cars. And I'm thinking to myself, well, this is ridiculous. I'm not buying that. I continue to search for cars, and after a while, that same car shows up again. So I'm looking at this and saying, well, it's actually a beautiful car, you know. But I'm not going to buy this, am I? Now, to make a long story short, I ended up buying the car. My wife still refers to it as my midlife crisis. I do stop at crosswalks. Yeah, thank you. Ironically, at the time I was making this purchase, I was also asked to write a paper, an opinion piece, but based on research, on the relationship between materialism. I do a lot of research on materialism, consumption, and happiness. So I write my paper, and while I'm writing my paper, I'm also thinking about my car. So I considered writing a fairy tale ending to my paper. I considered writing as a last sentence. And the author of this paper and his car lived happily ever after. So did we. It's probably not a big surprise to you that the initial excitement has waned off after a while. And am I still happy with my car? I would describe it more as a feeling of realistic contentment. Right? It has its disadvantages. I don't regret the purchase necessarily, but it's not really happiness. And so what happened here is something interesting. I adapted to this. And so that's one of the big dramas when we think of happiness and consumption. There's something that's called the hedonic treadmill effect. The hedonic treadmill effect is when we try to pursue happiness through consumption by improving our consumption, better quality, more, and it makes us happy for a while. So let me take you through an example. I assume that most of you, if not all of you, have been a college student at some point. And so think back of your living conditions back then. Back then I was fine, right? You're in a dorm, small room, little privacy, little space, but it's fine. Now once you graduate, move out, and you get your own apartment. And it's great because it's more space and it's privacy. And one of the things that makes it great is because there's a difference between what you have and what you actually want. What you want, well, you actually want something, and that's more than your current standard. You have a standard, which is your small dorm room, and you want something better, and you get that. And because you get something better than that you are used to, that makes you happy. But what happens over time is, whatever you just got, you get used to it. And that's the new normal. And your happiness declines. Your happiness with that purchase declines. So what do? You move out. You buy a house. Even more space. Even more privacy. No loud neighbors anymore. And it's great feeling. But again, the cycle continues. And after a while, you are as happy with your new house, that is not that new anymore, as you were before. You can actually cycle back to your pre-acquisition happiness. And so that's one of the big challenges for consumers to become happy through consumption. Now, there's a couple of points that I want to bring up when we talk about happiness and consumption. First point I want to bring up is that it's not entirely clear what we talk about when we talk about happiness. And so Lorden already kind of touched upon this. We think of happiness often as something hedonic. Happiness is pleasure, has to do with pleasure. We get something that makes us feel good. And that's what happiness is for most people. But there's actually another side to happiness. So this side to happiness, the pleasure side, is hedonic happiness. But there's another side. It's called eudaimonic happiness. And eudaimonic happiness is having a sense of purpose, having meaning in your life. And that is more along these Maslow hierarchy at the very, very top. Unfortunately, I'm a consumer behavior researcher. In my field, when we talk about happiness, we typically talk about this hedonic element. We don't do much research on this meaning and purpose. But I think there is a way to potentially connect consumption with meaning and purpose. Now, the second question, the second thing that I want to bring up is when we talk about, when we study happiness, we kind of define it narrowly, and when we study it, we usually base ourselves on self-reports. We ask people, how happy are you? And then based on what they say and based on their situations in their life, we make inferences of what makes people happy and what doesn't make them happy. Now that begs the question, can people actually report how happy they are? Do people know that? And it's interesting because if you ask people how happy they are on a sunny day, they report higher levels of happiness than they would on a rainy day. Even though it doesn't really make any sense, right? Your life doesn't change from day to day. It doesn't make sense. But there's these extraneous influences on our judgment of happiness. So, do we know how happy we are? Well, actually, there's some other research that suggests that to a good extent we actually do. But then the next question is, do we know what makes us happy? Even if we know how happy we are, do we know what makes us happy? And here is a big problem. The grass is always greener on the other side. We see something that other people have, and that's amazing. Think about moving to California, right? The weather is always nice. That must be great living in California, right? Until you get there. And then the weather is great, but you get, again, hedonic adaptation. You get used to that weather, but not necessarily to the traffic and all the other things. So we are very poor predictors of how we will feel in a different situation. We predict how we will feel, and then we experience something very different. And that makes it very hard for us to really plan our consumption. Because if there's anything that we're really good at, it's at making mistakes in these predictions. And there's actually, Dan Gilbert, a psychology professor at Harvard, has written a really good book about this. It's called Stumbling on Happiness. So I would really recommend that book. I'm making no money off it, but I really recommend that book too. So, other questions. Perhaps we adapt to things, right? But is it possible that some forms of consumption make us happier than other forms? Yes, fortunately that is the case. There's a good amount of research that shows that people can be happier if they start to spend money on experiences, not on products. We adapt to products. But experiences, for several reasons, bring us more happiness. Why? Well, one, we don't adapt as fast to experiences. Experiences are unique. And what we do with experiences, once we've lived through them, is that we have them in our minds, in our memory, and we revisit them from time to time. And they actually sometimes become better over time. So we don't have that adaptation. Two, they become stories. They become stories we tell other people. They become stories about ourselves. And this is important. I talked about meaning. Well, these experiences, they're much more connected to a meaning and identity construction for yourself than a material purchase would be. Third, when you think of experiences, I mean, you're all here. This is an experience. Many of you showed up with somebody else. Experiences often are shared with other people. Experiences are vehicles to connect with other people. And yes, that's one of these Maslow needs as well. Right? We need to connect with other people. We're social creatures. Experiences do that much better than products do. So that's another advantage. And is there something else? Yes. Social comparison that was alluded to before. We don't understand ourselves really well. We don't know how well off we are. So what do? We look at other people. What do other people have? And if we think of a house, I have a nice house, but my neighbor has a bigger house. How well off am I? I'm not very well. It doesn't feel good. But if I think of experiences, I mean, you're here now. Somebody else may go fishing. Is that better? No, it's different. Experiences don't lend themselves to these comparisons in terms of these vertical comparisons. This is better than that. No, it's just different. So we don't get that upwards social comparison with experiences as much as we do with products. And that's one of the reasons why, so we have several reasons why experiences are just better.
Thank you. And I'll just say thank you as well for inviting me here and having a chance to meet and talk to all of you. I think it's important to really understand how consumption has changed and how we sort of got to the situation that Amitai and Robert and so on have set before us, where in a sense we overconsume and where at the same time there's a lot of inequality in our own society. So, one of the dangers with historians is if you ask them the time of day, they'll give you the history of the watch. So I will try not to go too far back. But if we think about it, before the Industrial Revolution, essentially almost everyone was poor. There's hardly a tiny, what we would call today, a sort of middle class, just below those who, very, very small portion of people who are wealthy. And the great creation of the Industrial Revolution, which in a sense we're still living in right now, is that, in fact, that middle class has grown as much as it has into the 20th century, as well as all levels of society, including, in a sense, even the poor, being much better off. In fact, it's an interesting question right now to ask students in college classes. Would you rather be, a wealthy person in a very, very poor society, or would you rather be a poor person in a very wealthy society? And most of them think about those people who are, in some oil-rich but very, very poor country somewhere in the world who actually have some money and so on, and they say, oh, I think I'd rather be better off, be like them. But actually, for the vast majority of very, very poor countries, virtually everybody is poor. And even a lot of poor people in what we think of as wealthy societies, our own, are actually in many ways better off, all but the very, very lowest levels of the people in that society. So the big change in consumption in the late 19th century into the early 20th century is that people can actually spend much more. And yet, what's striking is how long it takes to really free people from needing the essentials. So in the United States in about 1920, so about 100 years ago, people spent 55%, the average person spent 55% of their income on food and clothing. 55%. So everything else is what's left for anything else that they would need, like furniture, or in a sense the discretionary expenditures that we value today. Today, that is less than 15%. The average American spends less than 15% just on food and clothing. It's sort of shocking in a way it does. Now, it is true, we spend 18% nationwide on health care. And in some ways, that item alone is, you might say it's a great discretionary item, but in many cases it's a necessity, and that's another problem. But really, the idea was that over the 20th century, and Amitai sort of referred to this, what we did after World War II, I would say even if you look across the world, societies as different as Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, Britain, under a conservative government, the New Deal, they all said we're going to get out of the Great Depression by actually generating a huge wave of consumption, and in a way it worked. So what that meant too is we lowered drastically the cost of the food and clothing, those basic necessities that a lot of people needed, and we created a real middle class. By about 1970, the middle class has about 60% of all the consumption expenditure in the United States, which means that that's the market. So you get all this generation of goods and advertising and everything built around TV and so on. And that's true in countries, most of the countries in Europe, Canada, Japan, most of the developed countries. South Korea and even Taiwan sort of imitated a little bit later, but it's the same trajectory. The negative aspect of that, and Amitai has spent a lot of his time as a researcher documenting this, of course, is what another social scientist called the phenomenon of bowling alone. With all that individualist consumption, and as Mario has put very well, where we just evaluate ourselves vis-a-vis what someone else has, or as Laura said, that's how we're judged, and we think we're judged. There's been a decline of so many of the richer associational ties that actually nurtured people through the Industrial Revolution into that middle class era into the 20th century. There's a European social scientist who studied what happened in Europe when that Americanization came in after World War II, and he referred to it as saying, the real doctrine that hurt Europe from America was not the Monroe Doctrine, it was the Marilyn Monroe Doctrine. Marilyn Monroe Doctrine, sort of his label for, you have pleasure and you can see things and life is better if somehow you just have this obvious joy or momentary pleasure and so on. So it's all that Hollywood and advertising and so on expends for us. Now, I think you have to realize, too, that that also generated, as Robert has said, this enormous waste. If you go back to late 19th century Paris, with a population in, let's say, about 1 million or something, I think there were about 30,000 people who made their living being what we would call rag pickers. Because this is just before paper is not going to be produced out of wood pulp. So in fact, you have this need for rags to produce paper, and it was, in a sense, we would call it today recycled. So people didn't waste very much. And just one example of my own life. As a little boy in, I guess it was the early 60s, I would go around with my cousin and some friends, and we would get these soft drink bottles because you could get, I don't know, a few pennies for them. And we did this as a way to, make some money on a Saturday, And you just didn't see them wasted because you got money for them. And when we switched to disposable aluminum cans, that went out the window. And except in a few places where there's a cost, where you can get money for recycling, we waste enormously, all those kinds of things. So it is true in that society, as constrained as it was in, say, the late Industrial Revolution, late 19th century, there was also a lot of scarcity. And in a sense, too, it made us not waste. So as constrained as it was, and with all the negative aspects of it, the offsetting things, and we didn't waste as much, and people created an associational life, which in a way was richer. And what we've seen since the 50s in America particularly is that the decline of that associational life and a much more focused perspective on individual consumption and consumerism. Social policies could change this. If you look at a lot of European countries particularly, but other countries around the world do this as well, they have value-added taxes, where they actually try to tax consumption. And there's a big debate among economists and political scientists of whether this is a just thing to do, because in some ways it could be construed, it is sometimes almost like another sales tax, which is, if you know anything, sales taxes are horribly unequal, right? I mean, poor people pay sales tax and rich people pay sales tax. For the rich people, it's a rounding error. For the poor, it's terrible. except in some states where certain items are exempted. But in general, that conception of trying to channel people's spending so that some things are not spent as much on, and if you want to buy a Ferrari or the sports car Mario, you're going to pay a whole lot more, and maybe you won't pay it, or if you do buy it, more of that money goes into the public purse and gets distributed into something of the common good. America in general, we've opted for and stuck with a very individualist set of social policies, which are very deeply rooted. We could change, but it's going to take the work of a lot of communitarians to try to change that, and journalists and activists and so on to move us away. One glimmer of hope I have is to talk to people from Asia and the Middle East and some other countries in terms of their attitude towards consumption. And it's those societies, it's new enough so we don't have that much information about it, as much research, but in some ways they seem less hung up in some ways about some of the conspicuous consumption that, frankly, in North America and Western Europe that we have. So there may be a glimmer of hope there that it doesn't have to be the way that we've actually generated this kind of consumer society.
Well, it's been an excellent start, and so we would like to invite the audience soon to join us, but let's just take another one quick minute. So I just want to make one short point, and then I need to get it back to you. So there are, I think, two competing narratives here, which are very complementary and sound very similar, but they ain't. And one is the Maslow story, and the other is the environmental story. The Maslow story says, if you are going to, once you have your basic needs satisfied, if you're then going to spend more of your life with your children, with your family, with community service, doing good, you're going to be happier. I'm not taking anything away from you. I'm not punishing you. I'm not saying less. I'm saying studies show that people in lasting relationships are happier than people who consume a lot. So it's a positive story. The environmentalist story, basically, though again they have their own, also their own positive packaging, is saying dial down, consume less, travel less, walk more. We're saying walking is going to make you happy. They say walking, you have to walk because otherwise we're going to all fry. And so I want us for the moment to focus on the Maslowian story. And you hinted as a promise that you're going to give us some public policies, but also promised that you're going to do it the other way around. So you started us with a VAT, a sales tax. So what I'm going to ask you each in kind of a closing round and a short round, please. If you for a moment play along and say that if people whose basic needs are satisfied, if they spend more time in relationship and in meaningful activities, they may not be suffering, they'll be more content, maybe not happy, but more content. What public policies can we put in place to encourage them to see the light? Should we put a tax on advertising? Or, so each one of you have a short time to solve that problem, 1 minute or less.
The only kind of public policy I can think of that would be the most easily achievable, I think, would be a fairer tax structure. I think that would be, already poor people in this society don't pay very many taxes or very little at all. We could even do that even more and basically recycle some of the funds to things that they need: childcare, healthcare. Those things ease the burden of, I'd say, everybody up at least through the mid 50% of the range. And I think that would help people a great deal. And in terms of life satisfaction, would be a huge stress reliever. I mean, if you talk to people what troubles their life, a lot of families, it's things like childcare and healthcare, and from a lot of people who have to worry about their aged parents as well.
Mario, before you go on, this process you describe, that people get A, they want B, and when they want B, they want C. Can we not have the same thing for relationships? So I know senior people who've been taken to a senior center, but they have time to spend time with each other and play dominoes and such. I think they're happier to have more hours there. So can we have the same building up of expectations, not just about consumer goods, but also about relationships?
Oh, that's a really good question.
Thank you.
Yeah. I don't know of any research that speaks to that, but I would say I've never gotten bored of my friends, and I would say that the more exposure I have and more time I have with them, the happier I will be. So I don't think there is this hedonic adaptation to having more hours with friends. And one of the reasons why that may be the case is, one, it is an experience, and two, it's unique. Even if you play dominoes the whole time, it's always a different game, and something else happens in that game. So I would say no, I don't. If I would do a prediction, I haven't seen the research. I would have to do a prediction. I don't think we will adapt to better and more and deeper social connections.
About the other question, any policies you have for us to be
Yes.
more content with consuming less?
I have to agree that taxation makes the most sense. Education doesn't work. We know that from health education. It doesn't work. The advertising, yes,
Ouch.
advertising would be great if we could curb it, but the advertisers want to self-regulate, and that obviously doesn't work at all. So I think taxation makes the most sense, but it's also going to be the hardest sell.
By the way, for a long time, it was banned to advertise medications on television, and since we allowed it, the sales of medication have increased by 30%, and many of them are not necessarily improving people's health. Like, people feel they have to take X pills to be regular, and I'm not sure there is an ultimate medical evidence that they have to take a lot of pills to do that. But
I'd actually like to propose a policy that is an even harder sell, which is not realistic, but nonetheless, I would actually think that we should consider limits on income. Now, taxation can sometimes achieve the same thing, but I actually think that if people can't even dream about reaching the heights of income that the very rich do, they have to perhaps change what it is they're aiming towards. And just to then address the other part of your question about how do we encourage people to spend more time in relationships, I'm not entirely sure that we actually should be doing that overly more than perhaps we already do. And that's because I think that it in itself can turn into a competition in the same way that consumption can. And when we see the ways in which people perhaps of younger generations, but I think in older generations too, use communication devices to always be in touch and worry about what happens when they're not. Sometimes I think that the problem maybe is not that we aren't surrounded by other people, but that we don't know when we are allowed to withdraw.
Well, I like the way Laura thinks about income. I'm not sure I would entirely endorse that. I think there are ways that you can deal with taxation that don't necessarily mean you have to not have income. But actually, it's interesting that when you tax consumption, you tax the real thing that results from income. If income is used for savings and investment, it's much less damaging in a lot of ways than spending. But I think there's multiple tax opportunities, mostly on the consumption side, and it doesn't have to be regressive. Certainly a basic sales tax is regressive, but the idea that a number of Republican leaders and Jim Hansen, scientists, have about carbon taxes, for example, that you tax carbon and all of the money is returned to people on a per capita basis for just being a citizen or a resident of a country or of a community. It turns out that's a progressive tax, surprisingly enough, simply because low-income people use so much less carbon than high-income people. So there's lots of opportunities to do that, and I'd play around with that. Advertising, you can tax advertising. Generally, we think about advertising as free speech. Now, unfortunately, someone along the line kind of like Citizens United decided that just like corporations are people, advertisement is speech, so we think it's untouchable. But businesses take tax deductions for their advertising spending. We don't have to allow that to happen. We could actually tax advertising. You could also prohibit advertising, as we do already for certain kinds of things. We prevent certain kinds of advertising around schools or in schools. We could do much more of this. We could also promote part-time work. We could try to shorten the work week, which was frankly a real success in Europe and in the United States over the past couple of centuries. We could do it more. When people work less, they tend to spend more time. They might choose just to simply consume more or watch television, but there's good evidence that they also spend time with their families and they spend time with their friends, which is, I think, among the things we're trying to aim for. There are interesting developments along the lines of corporate restructuring. For example, benefit corporations and B Corps, which are ways to try to convince corporations to think about the well-being of their workers, their communities, their environmental impact. That starts to change things. These are all a long way from happening, but I guess I would finish by making one key point. There's a lot of people who think that you can't really do anything individually because these are really huge global issues and individual action is meaningless in the context of what we're doing to the world as a whole. But that's not really true. There's a real power in what some people have called behavior contagion, by which when people begin to respond differently to stimuli and when they consume differently, for example, it actually has an impact on your neighbors and your friends, positively and negatively. It's like the old driver's ed thing that, you know, if you're mannerly in traffic, the next person will let someone in front of them. And if you flip the bird at somebody in a car, the next person's going to do the same thing. This applies to consumption behavior too. And when you just state that it's a value of yours and you make it clear it's a value of yours to be with people, the people you care about, and to try to improve yourself personally and individually and contribute something to your community, it has an impact. And you also help build a social movement of the kind I think we're already starting to see. And events in the tide of history, I think, are going to increase this, of more people being concerned about society and the survival of society as a whole.
Well, you may want to go to your last issues of the New Yorker, and you see a lot of discussion on voluntary simplicity of people who are affluent but choosing to lead a simpler life. One of the articles deals with a movement called minimizing, so it's complicated. The idea is that you go to your closet and throw out all the things you didn't use for the last 3 weeks, or 3 months, I mean. But it turns out that for some people it means they do that in order to love more the objects which remain. That's not exactly in line with Maslow. But for some people, minimizing means simply having less objects and more a relationship. So that's 2 issues back. And in the other issue, we have a discussion of degrowthing. The people who are interested in growing less. So I very much like to just add one line about the other side of the coin. Obviously, if people don't work as much, then they will have less money to spend, and they'll have to spend time in other activities which are meaningful, but are not having a big footprint and are not involving a lot of consumption. And the French, of course, take at least a month off in August. In Japan, they still feel very guilty if they take more than 3 days, and you can see the difference in how culture makes a difference. I can't resist to tell you a very quick story about this August in France. So last year in August, a reporter called the Anti-Terrorism Center in Paris and asked to speak to the director, and the secretary said he's on vacation. And she said, okay, let me talk to the deputy. And she says, on vacation. Well, it turned out the whole Anti-Terrorism Center was on vacation except the one secretary, because in August, France closes down. So it can be done, you know. And also the idea of a 35-hour working week, or taxing overtime, or the 4 days working week, which Scandinavia is talking about. So the other half of the story, there's a lot of mileage there. As long as we, in my judgment, don't say that something the government pushes down your throat for the larger good, but it's something which is going to make us better and you better, and there is no necessarily contradiction. Now it's your turn. If you please enjoy this microphone here and join the conversation, questions, comments, speeches. If you kindly come over here to the microphone, please. This is all being recorded. You're going to find yourself on YouTube, so you're all warned. You are on YouTube when you do that. So.
Hi, everybody. And just to be in full disclosure, Bob and I have been friends since like the age of 5, so we're going 63 years now. And he's going to be in part of my question here, so that's why I wanted to point that out. I think one of the baseline things you've talked about, and what is it, to reach this level of consumerism, is that you have to have basic needs. You have to have shelter, and you have to have nourishment. I grew up outside of Washington here during the days of Johnson's Great Society. I worked as a teenager picking up press releases at 19th and M Street at their office of the Office of Economic Opportunity to distribute those grants, notices to newspapers and to Capitol Hill. The neighborhood we're sitting in right now was a vibrant middle-class black neighborhood that was bulldozed down in the name of urban renewal. And that's why you see all these shiny new buildings here rather than row houses. We've thrown a lot of money at poverty, both in the inner cities and also through rural America down through the Appalachians. It was done back in the Great Society. And just as a story that sort of shows my frustration with what is not solving that issue for America, is I remember Bob was going to the University of Chicago. We must have been in our late teens, early 20s. And one night I got a wild hair up my butt and I hitchhiked out to see him out in Chicago. Ended up in the middle of Hyde Park. He just lived a few blocks from there. And we were right in the middle of all this abject poverty. And we saw a little bit of urban renewal going around, but not a great deal. About 2 years ago, I read an article about a 6-year-old who was shot in Chicago in gang violence. And I wrote Bob this letter saying, how in the F can this be going on 40 years later after all of these efforts to change the urban blight and to make society better? So is there a solution to urban poverty, to rural poverty? Can we throw just money at it, or is there something else that we can do that will lift society and maybe change the direction we're headed in? Okay, thank you.
That is a big question. I'll just give you a tiny example. I mean, I do think public policy makes a big difference. Tiny examples, the neighborhood my wife and I lived in, we just moved here within the last year, in Columbia Heights. So Columbia Heights has had some degree of what people would have called gentrification, but it's hit its limit, I think, because those parts of the neighborhood that can be taken down and bigger buildings put up doesn't seem like it can be expanded anymore. And there is subsidized and low-income housing that's there, but as far as I know, the city's not moving. And a number of the projects, too, are also owned by various nonprofits. And also there's been retail that's been put in. And I've talked to older neighbors, or people who've been in the neighborhood a lot longer, and said what a difference it made to actually get sort of mixed income in the neighborhood. Because for one thing, with the retail, the lower-income families in Columbia Heights have jobs right nearby that they didn't have access to before. So a lot of it is zoning and intentional placement of mixtures of people and levels of income. And ours is maybe a little bit of an exceptional neighborhood because, as you know, you go farther west in D.C., it's not like that. You go farther east, it's a lot less like that. We're sort of in that area that sort of straddles the income divide in some ways, and unfortunately also to some degree the racial divide in D.C. But it is clear those cities that have really tackled that zoning issue and have not tried basically to make it all uniform have made at least some small impact.
Anybody else wants to join us?
Well, let me just say, and it also shows the power of consumption, because it's also, I mean, the positive side of it for those lower income families is it is jobs.
Yeah, can I just add a few words to that, since my friend Robert Pickrell there mentioned me, and he's one of the people I love to spend time with, not consuming anything, but occasionally we drink a little bit and do some other things. But a lot of this has to do with the fact that politicians and the media don't pay enough attention to poverty. Even Democratic politicians are mostly I think more about the middle class than the poor. I was sorry to see Yang drop out of the race for just the simple reason that he brought a really interesting issue to the fore that I think we ought to be talking about, universal basic income. There's studies of income that when you give people money, they actually tend to do pretty good things with it. They don't, to the extent this has been studied in Mexico, it's been studied in Asia and a few societies, and Finland is experimenting with it right now. But it seems that for the most part, when you give people some, I'm not talking about a lot of money, but just simply enough money to help them provide shelter for themselves and to buy food, they tend to use it wisely. And I think much more important than economic growth, and this relates to the degrowth, which Amitai mentioned. I'm glad he did. Degrowth is a really important concept. The media is fixated on economic growth. This country is fixated on economic growth. Politicians are fixated on economic growth. But the big problem this country has and this society has and the world has is not so much economic growth as economic maldistribution. We have growing inequality. So we should be thinking about policies and whether it's universal basic income or public jobs or just a real focus on the poor, the people who need the most help, would be something that I think ought to get into politics. And for that reason, as I say, I was sorry that Yang dropped out of the race. I hope the idea will still live on in politics.
Let me just say, when you think about inequality, it actually ties very directly to our issue in the following way. As long as the rich feel that they need one more, and that somebody did a study, asked everybody up and down the income, how much more income they need to be happy, and they all said 20%, however much income they had. So as long as people have that mentality, we're not going to get seriously a redistribution of wealth unless we really think we're going to mount the barricades and shoot them all. And we know when that was tried, how that ended up with a new privileged class. So under what conditions do the rich are really willing to share? It's when there is a new faith of sharing. That's what Christianity did to Rome. All my students who are upper middle class kids, they're full of left, they're all for Sanders. Now, how did that happen? Because they firmly believe in social justice. So what we're talking about here is a change in what we consider right. Without that, I don't think we're going to get the rich to willing to redistribute in a major way. Please.
Actually, that's kind of along the lines of what I was going to say. In the 1960s and 70s, and maybe similarly to other gray-haired people here, I was a hippie, and my husband was a hippie, right? And we decided we wanted to put our children through college, but we didn't. We were working factory jobs because we were organizing for revolution, right? So we obviously didn't have any money. Even though some of us came from money, we did not have money. And so the result of that is that you don't spend any money, and you're doing it voluntarily. And my grown-up children today say they grew up in a very strange household. They didn't know you could buy clothes at retail stores. They thought you could only buy them at thrift stores. And we had a year when we used no paper other than toilet paper. We spent no money on paper. That's pretty unusual for intellectuals. And I'm thinking that it's not static. If I did that in the 70s, along with a huge wave of other people of my generation, and if you listen to the young people who are interested in the environment now, I think they're going to do the same or similar things. I think some of the assumptions, I loved your talks. I came some last year and I come this, it's my second one this year. But I think there's an assumption that things are going to stay the way you're analyzing them, and that's not true. But I love your talks, so I'm not going to. And as far as Maslow, yes, I studied Maslow. Doesn't everybody in college have to study Maslow at some point? And I remember the whole concept at different times in my life of believing that I had reached the top, that I was self-actualized. But I think Laura's comment that, does that come from inside us or does that come from outside somewhere, was very interesting. So I think that we don't have to worry about it, our generation. I think it's going to change.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me just say something about the counterculture. It's interesting. There have been hundreds through history of movements such as kibbutzim and such, who believe that the way to solve the problem is by leading a very austere life. And they all failed. And that's where, again, I don't want to kind of canonize Maslow, but that's where Maslow's insight is important. If you try to deny people's basic creatures' comforts and tell them to live on cheap wine, sunsets, and sex, that's not going to work. I'm sorry, it's not going to work. And that's why the counterculture burned out. We need to accept that people have basic needs, they are legitimate, and just ask them not to get addicted to them to the point that once they have their basic needs satisfied, they cannot move up the Maslow scale. Anybody else cares to join us, please do.
So I have two comments. One has to do with the idea of the part-time work week. Among hourly workers, part-time work is plenty much out there. So before we move too much down that, we have to make sure that we're raising the minimum wage as well if we're gonna go to something like that, particularly for hourly workers. But I also have a question. Listening some comment from some of you have talked about the sociology of all of this. It seems to me, as I'm looking at downsizing my own house and going through my father's house and downsizing, that a lot of the things that are in there are the map of my life, right? This isn't rampant consumerism, but why I can't get to just the things that spark joy is that they are telling the story of my life. And I realize that part of that comes from the fact that we have this more atomized family structure and atomized social structure, and we don't have a community telling us the stories or sharing the stories with us, and so we hold on to these objects to tell the stories. And I just wondered what you sociologists thought about that.
That's a really interesting insight, and I, of course, I'm not a Marie Kondo fan myself. I don't think that we are going to just get joy by talking to our objects as we dispose of them. Your comment, though, it makes me think that I absolutely understand and agree with you that when we are surrounded by objects that relate us to the past, our families, our friends, our childhoods, it's very meaningful, and I actually don't think we can expect people to give it up. I think one thing, though, that has changed over time is the expectation that we can capture that history, which is to say it's not just about the photographs, which are everywhere now, when they wouldn't have been in the past. But I think that for prior generations, what you learned of your family were often just tidbits. They were sort of glimpses of the past that often an older generation did not want to talk about. And we had to be satisfied with what they gave us. And I think that now there is the possibility of accumulating so much documentation on our own lives and the lives of prior generations, it becomes that much harder to give up that opportunity. Yes, that's right. It becomes a responsibility to us and to the future. Yeah.
So let me add to that. So I do research on materialism, and it's a very bad word, materialism. But actually, there's another way of looking at materialism. It is just we're all materialistic. We all use products. We all use brands to kind of construct our identity. So who we are, we kind of show to other people who we are. We show it to ourselves who we are. And we do that through consumption, through products. So in that respect, it's actually not bad to have all these mementos there. It actually goes overboard in present day, and I agree with you, what you said, is where people are so obsessed with capturing everything on video, on photo, and there's research showing that once you start doing that, you actually do not enjoy the moment anymore. You put yourself outside the moment. And so yes, you have your picture afterwards, but it doesn't mean anything anymore. And it's just a picture to show off to other people, but it doesn't mean anything. So actually there too, less is more. So it's great to have that memento, but perhaps we shouldn't over-document our lives, virtual, digital or otherwise.
No, I think it's a very nice point. The camera comes between you and the experience.
Well, I'd like to say I particularly like the idea of living a life with experiences and sharing those times with friends, which my wife and I are now, of course, with the financial resources, we can do much of that. But on the other hand, I've always heard that our economy is driven by consumption, all the products that get produced and create jobs to produce those. If we change the balance to many more experiences, it would change the dynamics of our economy tremendously. We'd be going to places like this, 2 times a week, right? Or come to talks like this. I guess a question primarily for Mario, have economists begun to look at what the economy would look like how much would we change the balance of consumption of products versus experiences? I mean, the hotel industry would go up because we travel more and experience places, and in restaurants, we already have a lot in DC, but maybe that would go up even more. So I'm sort of curious about whether we can, what the economy would look like if we in fact did something like that.
So I haven't seen anybody making that prediction, but I can tell you that experiences are not necessarily cheaper than products are. So yeah, and they need to be produced as well. So it's a different form of economy, and actually we are already shifting a good amount in that direction. Right? There's a lot more people. There's actually manufacturing is down, right, compared to what it was before. And there's so many people working in the service industry. Those are the ones that help us create our experiences. So it doesn't make us consume less, it makes us consume different.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about our trade balance, right? I mean, instead of all the things being produced in China, or before that it was Japan, now we would be bringing jobs to the U.S. in many cases, unless you're traveling overseas.
But let's stay with this for a minute. I think there are many economists who argue that if you consume less, the economy is going to collapse. And so, for instance, now when the economy is slowing in China, or because of the virus, everybody says, oh my God, we have to stimulate the economy. So the theory is that we have to run every faster in order to be able to stand like on a bicycle. So is it a crazy bicycle, or can we get off?
Yeah, I think the premise is wrong, really. That's for one thing. Experiences, you can interpret them different ways, but quite a lot of experiences and quite a lot of the service economy doesn't do as much. I mean, again, I go back to the environment, which is a real limit we have to be thinking about. It's a good thing if we can find out a way to not super grow the economy, to get off the bicycle, to use Amitai's image here, but still meeting basic needs of people. And I think really economists aren't thinking very creatively about this at all. They say, yes, if we don't consume, we're in really deep trouble. I think, frankly, environmental scientists are thinking more creatively about it, that we need to find ways, and there are ideas out there. With 10 minutes left or less, we don't have enough time to go through them all, but there are ways out there to think about stabilizing the economy. We can slow population growth. We know how to do that through access to reproductive health and rights and improving the status and the power of women and girls in the world. There's lots of things we can do that actually would restructure an economy that would work for the world as a whole and would actually sustain the environment. And experience is part of it. I'll just make one quick plug, which is for mindfulness meditation. One of the great things about mindfulness meditation, everyone can do it. It's easy, it's free, and it brings you to the present moment, and it is all about experiencing the present moment rather than documenting your past or fretting about your future. So I'll put that little pitch in there as a sort of anti-consumption is mindfulness meditation.
Let me just say, if you want to look in a society which does exactly what we are talking about, let's go back to France. I'm not a Francophile, but they decided, in effect, or not in those words, we're going to work less. We're going to work 35 hours a week. We're not going to do overtime. We're going to take a lot of vacation. And our GDP is going per capita is going to be smaller. So in effect, though it's not the way they talk about it, they, as if they had a meeting, they decided we're going to work less, consume less, and drink happy ever after. So.
Yes, just two quick points. One is that consumption of services is still consumption, right? Because you're employing labor, people who will have to buy food and clothing and shelter too. So by moving away from material goods to services, you are not necessarily moving away from a consumerist society. Right. The second point is pursuant to what you were just talking about, which is the shift in the labor force. Once you start consuming fewer material goods, what do people do for a living? And how do they find jobs? And one can imagine a larger scenario in which all of this is orchestrated through education and so on. But the shift is going to be slow and it's going to be extremely painful. If you start slapping on sales taxes or VAT taxes, whatever form they take, this will be an inevitable and instant result. And that will create political problems. Because how are you going to deal with the politics of unemployment caused by a reduction in consumption? Not that I'm against reducing consumption, but it's simply a problem which I think has to be dealt with as part of all the other issues that were raised by the panel.
I agree. This kind of a shift is not an easy one to make, and it has to be sort of modulated, all right? And in many ways, that's not what the United States is very good at. So a good example is when we had things like NAFTA or other trade agreements that help bring more goods in from outside. Other countries, I'll give you an example. I'm from Michigan. If you look at the auto industry in Michigan, very little was done for auto workers when there was a shift in goods coming in from outside. The Canadians, right across the border, sometimes the same companies, the same unions, the government did a much better job, both at the provincial level and the Canadian federal level, to actually retrain them. And we're not talking about them going to college. I mean, I'm talking about vocational training, sort of the junior community college sort of model. And it eased the transition for a lot of these communities much more. So yes, these transitions are not easy. I think they can be done. And in general, other countries that have opened themselves up to trade and managed to do well, they've done it, for example, by doing that kind of re-education and worker development and so on. If it can be done in trying to handle the openness of the world economy, I think it could also be done in transitioning to a more equitable economy that's less consumption driven and more holistic. But you're right, it's not an easy set of policies. I think it could be done.
One thing to keep in mind is that the demographic change that's happening is that we're an aging society. We're going to have a smaller proportion of people in the labor force anyway, which is a big worry to economists. But if we handle things right, and I think this is a matter of dealing with policies, we're used to doing this. We did it very well. It took a little time, but during the Great Depression, there were solutions we found. We can find ways to make sure that people have what they need, employment if they want it, a universal basic income if that's what's required, but it doesn't mean there has to be disaster. We can solve that problem. Much easier to solve than things like climate change and global pandemics, frankly.
A couple of points on consumption, by the way. The word consumption, the way it's used here, means spending. We're talking about spending the whole time. But consumption is much more than spending. Consumption is also going out and using what you spend your money on. If you buy fishing gear, consumption is not the purchase. It is the purchase, but it's more than that. It's each time you use it. And in fact, that is where spending on experiences, on things that matter to us that we can use, that can help slow down consumption in the form of spending, in the form of waste production. And you talked about mindfulness. Mindfulness is great. Mindfulness not only makes you happy, but also makes you appreciate what you have more, right? Because one of the things, this hedonic adaptation, what it does is we forget the things that are constant in our lives. We don't appreciate them anymore. I have a silent dishwasher at home. I have to remind myself, I have a silent dishwasher at home. I have to be mindful of that fact. And that makes me happy with that consumption.
Hello. So my parents were hippies, but I grew up in a world of fast fashion and the latest iPhone every year, and also societal pressure that we can't wear the same outfit, more than once every 2 weeks or something like that. And I'm just curious, I hear a lot about circular economy, and I'm wondering if you have examples of, circular economy, and if that approach can bring the jobs that we're talking about.
So thank you for that. As we close, let me just say the following. Historically, we had societies in which had other values than consumption. So the ancient Greeks, the idea was to spend a lot of time in public life. And in the traditional Jewish shtetl, learning was appreciated. But in a Chinese society, philosophy and poetry was appreciated. These were the things which are valued most. In all those societies, there was a small layer of people who were allowed to do that. Everybody else had to work, so these people could do what was most appreciated. So what we are envisioning is a society in which the machines, the new AI smart machines, they will do the work, they will be the slaves, they will be the working class, and the rest of us, the human beings, will all be like the males were in the Jewish shtetl, or the free citizens were in the agora. And so we come to a world in which we can all now participate in the good life not defined as a lot of consumption, but good life defined as being committed to others, committed to meaningful activities, to family, children, and to protection of the environment. Well, before I ask you to thank to the panelists for what was, I thought, excellent discussion, let me invite you to our next meeting, where we're going to discuss money. We're going to be talking about finance of campaigns, and we're going to ask the question if contributions to politicians are legalized bribery or free speech. So I hope to see you all here next time, virus or no virus. And please thank me to the panel for an excellent discussion.